Welcome everyone to another episode of Tutorial Tuesday. It's week 19, 2020, and I just want to thank you again for tuning in and participating. Without your participation, we don't have these Tutorial Tuesdays, so thank you. Just one announcement, and then we'll get into the ton of questions that are already starting to fill up here, and that is, if you haven't yet listened to the latest episode of the Small Business Roundup podcast, with my wife Jo and I, we talk about communication. You'll want to go ahead and do that by swiping over. It'll take you right to the podcast page, and you can listen on all devices across all platforms. So tune in to that and listen as we talk about communication. With that, let's get into your questions. And also, I'm going to take you to a print lab with me today because I got to get an order in for a business that has a grand opening on Friday. So we'll be doing that too. Let's go. Chelsea, great question. So I would say this, should you upgrade? Is it worth it? And you're looking at the Mark IV. The Mark IV is an outstanding camera. I would highly recommend it. I've used it for several years now, and it's phenomenal, even on the video side. Second, when should you upgrade? Well, that's kind of subjective, and that's based on your experience. I would say when I upgrade, it's because the life of my camera has reached its end. You know, say we're looking at 200,000 shutter clicks on a camera, but also I'm intuitively familiar with my camera. I can move around manual without even thinking about it. And a lot of people, I would recommend getting to that point before you upgrade to something like the Mark IV. Much like everything in photography, this can have many, many answers. For me, a lot of clients will seek me out for my vision. Now, people want unique visions. They don't want the same thing over and over, so that's a creative challenge for myself. Now, let's take, for example, that image of Renee that I posted today, and I'll post that just on the next slide here, but this was just a random massive windstorm that came in, but provided an otherworldly experience. So now in that image, depending on the time of evening, I had to adjust because that light fades so quickly and you have a very narrow window. So with this one, ISO 100, f2.8, 1/3200th of a second. So with images that I take that are backlit, if I'm filling the frame as I am here in this little clip, I would try and keep a little bit of detail in my subject because they're filling up the frame. In that case, my settings would change. But with that picture of Renee, with her being a smaller part of a larger scene, I didn't want all that detail. While you can still zoom in and you can see a little bit of detail, I call that a modified silhouette, I wanted to stop that light down. All right, we got official approval from Nichols Photo Lab, who I'm using to do these great big metal prints for our grand opening on Friday. You'll be coming along with me to see that process, so stay tuned. How do you figure out your fees? Well, that's easy. It depends on whether your mortgage or water bill is due. No, I'm kidding. There are industry standard ways of figuring this out. Let's talk about that real quick. I recently said in a group that nothing gets a cricket's chirping like talking pricing. And for a lot of people, especially if this is a side hustle or something like that, it can be a little onerous for you to set these fees initially. One of the top things that you have to determine first is what your cost of doing business is. And that's going to include things like monthly subscription fees, equipment, website fees, licensing, gas, stuff like that. Now, once you figure out what your cost of doing business is, one other thing that you need to figure out is how much you're going to charge an hour. So are you worth $25 an hour or $10 an hour or $200 an hour? And factor that in as well. Now, in that last one, you have to figure out what you're worth, and that's going to be subjective. Have you been in the industry a year? Are you using a kit camera? You know, are you familiar with manual? Take all these things into account. Something else that's going to be a challenge is going to be those folks that are in a rural area that have to travel long distances to get where they're going, and then adding that fee in and outpricing where you're at. Chip, thank you for the question. I appreciate that. You guys, if you don't follow along the Cowboy CPA, you'll want to click on that, give him a follow. Chip, regarding your question, filter photos in bright sun, one of the things I do is I darken that image. So what I do in photography speak is I stop down my aperture or I stop down my shutter speed, meaning I'll go to like 1/2000th of a second to just get more of a silhouette and reduce the overall highlights in that image. Now, maybe there's some of you out there that aren't familiar with all the photography speak, and in that case there are different ways in editing, like if you're using Snapseed or another editing app, you can reduce the exposure. Thank you for the compliment. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you tuning in. Okay, this is going to be a quick tutorial, and fill flash is nothing more than filling in the dark shadows on the opposite side of the lit face or subject. So let's take a look at how we do that. Okay, so the tutorial is this. Right now I'm using a fill light to fill in this shadow side of my face from the main light, the sun, coming in over there. And let's look at what happens when I turn that light off. Okay, so now the light is off, and we can see on the shadow side of my face it's more contrasty. We have the main light, the sun, over there coming through the window, and I can use my wife's notebook right there to fill in the shadows. That is the absolute basics of using fill, whether that be flash, a white notebook, a reflector, a whiteboard, something that fills in the shadow side of your face. Excellent question. I've had 5Ds from the original 12.8 megapixel 5Ds all the way up to and including the 5D Mark IV. I know these cameras really well, and what I mean by that is the intuition. After using these cameras for so long, you get so used to the noises and the sounds that the camera makes when you're taking and recording images. And one of those really technical speak here is it gets clunky. Now, I know that's a highly scientific term, clunky, but for sports action shooters, they're going to experience the same thing, and you get very intuitive with your equipment, and you feel when it's going bad. I'll give you a real-world example. A friend of mine called me up a few days ago, and they had dropped their camera, and the back of the LCD was black, and they didn't know if the whole camera was trashed, so we did a process of elimination. What I had them do was take the card out, format it, recharge the battery, put it all back in, go out, take pictures, and upload those. And what we need to find out is, can the image still be recorded, and is it just LCD? As it turns out, it just appeared to be the back of the LCD that was trashed, which still means it needs to be sent in and replaced, but you can still use the fundamental features of the camera. Hey guys, real quick, I just want to break in and let you know that I'm going to be down in Tempe, Arizona on June 7th. I'll be attending a workshop that my friend and Canon Explorer of Light, Bruce Dorn, will be putting on in association with Tempe Camera down there. Now, check out that next slide. You can see how to sign up, and if you haven't yet, you want to check these out. Learn from one of the best in the industry with 40 plus years of experience. You won't be disappointed with Bruce's presentation, because I think he also throws in a little comedy. So check that out, you guys. Hey, it's all good. That exposure triangle is a fundamental piece to photography, and figuring that out, and it's really the relationship between your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. Here's a couple resources. And here's the first one. Last Wednesday or Wednesday before last, I can't keep track of my dates, I did a Western Wednesday, and it was all about exposure and these relationships. So check that out by swiping over. And here's the second one. This is me going out with my wife Jo in the wintertime and figuring out an exposure. I take you through the process, so swipe over and check that out. Now let's do exposure in 1 minute. So basically, exposure is the brightness or darkness of an image, and the way that it gets brighter or darker is the use of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Okay, now our aperture controls the volume of light that's let down the lens, but it also controls how much or how little is in focus in your image. And it does that by, let's say f2.8 is a big hole like that, and f11 is a little hole. Now our shutter speed controls the amount of time that the light hits your sensor. But shutter speed also controls whether or not your subject is frozen or it's blurry. So think of somebody roping. If you want the rope frozen, you need a higher shutter. And finally, while ISO isn't technically part of the exposure triangle, for purposes of this discussion, it is, and that is, it's your camera's sensor sensitivity to light. That's it. The last thing that I would say about exposure is once you understand that relationship, a creative exposure is an authentic expression of your artistic vision. Courtney, you don't owe me anything. I'm just glad that we were able to get that part of it at least figured out. And mention out to Cayenne, thank you for having Courtney give me a ring. And we were able to at least figure part of it out. Hopefully you get it fixed by the workshop. When you're referring to fast-moving subjects and my focus settings, when I'm dealing with people that are roping and they're moving around, like somebody coming in for the heels, I'm usually using servo, which is Canon's predictive focusing method. And for the record, I'll be using shutter speeds of somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/1000th of a second up to 1/2500th of a second, depending on the conditions. The quick answer to this is no, I haven't. The minimum ISO that I use is 100, and I'll usually stop down to something like f4 or even 5.6. Hey guys, as we wrap up week 19 of Tutorial Tuesday, I just want to thank you for tuning in and participating. I apologize for not being able to go over to the photo lab and show you the print process, but in lieu of that, I will be going to an early morning branding tomorrow, and I will be taking you along with that. I'll be doing some Insta updates, of course, and I might even go live. We'll see about that, but thank you so much for tuning in and participating. We'll see you next week.